Kia ora koutou katoa. Welcome to the Hoon, where co-host Peter Bale and I go around the week's news in geopolitics and Aotearoa's political economy, with a whole bunch of experts, academics and politicians, all to understand our worlds better and have some fun. Kia ora koutou katoa, everyone. It's wonderful to have you on. What a week.
Bernard.
Yes,
How are
and
you?
Peter, you look fantastically relaxed and
I'm
filled with
always
nature
relaxed,
there.
Bernard, 'cause no, I am filled with nature. I'm at one with nature, although nature is quite cold up here in the mountains, and
So tell
I've
us
been
where
up
you
to this
are.
place many times. It's in the Nelson Lakes National Park, secret location, my hideout. You don't want to tell the Department of the Department of Conservation this, but I'm building a sort of Peter Thiel style underground lair. Because I'm a
Really?
prepper. Yeah. So I can dig down into the glacial rocks and build myself a little place to go and hide out when things get really shitty. But yeah, it's quite cold up here, Bernard. There was snow on those hills behind me, the St Arnaud Range.
Wow.
First arrived the other.
Bugger, here comes winter. That is a pain. So it's been a heck of a week. We seem to have lost you there for a moment there, Peter. Um, that's okay. We have you back now.
I'm here.
I am going. Yep, that's good. It's been a heck of a week, and I wanted to spend
Well, how has
an
it been a heck of a
extended.
week, Bernard? Apart from if you're at TVNZ and News Hub, how has it been a heck of a week? Tell us.
Well, let's start on that actually. News today that 68 people from TVNZ have lost their jobs. That's about half the newsroom. That's
Yeah,
on top
although
of
not all those
all of the
68 are in the newsroom, correct? I mean, that's the
most of them
total
are.
number of losses across the organisation. But yeah, it is a
It's
significant
focused on
set of
news and
losses.
current
Yes,
affairs.
yeah,
Yeah. And it is a massive blow for news gathering, particularly television news gathering in this country, a week after the planned removal of the entire TV3 News Hub operation. And we've heard news of more job losses as well at Stuff in the last week or so. Really, this is you'd have to say, the darkest days of New Zealand news media for jobs, at least in a long time, and has come a couple of weeks after the CEOs of New Zealand's newsrooms told the politicians, unless we get some help, there's going to be some collapses,
it's
and
going to
that's
be
exactly
blood.
what's
Yeah,
happened.
yeah. I think one of the difficulties in this, Bernard, and in fact, Rua, one of our Rua MD, has mentioned my appearance on Q&A last week,
Yeah.
sort of leading up to this. This is not unfamiliar territory to me and for me, both in New Zealand and elsewhere. And I'm also helping with a project that Sir Peter Button, the former head of science in New Zealand, is doing for his Koi2 think tank, which is a sort of submission to Melissa Lee to say, here's the situation as we see it. And because Sir Peter's organisation is devoted to democracy, it's all about what the risks for this is to democracy. Not, so it's, because the media we can be self-indulgent. I mean, we'll have friends at TVNZ who are in trouble, and certainly at News Hub, but there is a democratic aspect to this, which is how does the media in New Zealand, or how does the difficulties in media in New Zealand flow into a kind of potential democratic crunch? And so that's going to be the focus of that work. But yeah, we hosted a kind of summit of the New Zealand media leaders, and this was very clear, and there were some answers too. Like in the case of News Hub and TVNZ, bear a huge amount of cost for distribution. It will be very interesting to see if TV3 goes off the linear broadcast network run by Cordia by the end of the year, which would increase the expenses for TVNZ, not reduce them. So there's some really
Oh,
interesting
really? Gosh.
regulatory and economic aspects that the government could do things with that don't get involved with subsidies as such. Because I think Bernard, that unlike quite a few others, I am not an incredible fan of a link tax or a direct subsidy transfer between Google and Facebook to the New Zealand media. That's not to say, however, that some sort of tax on digital advertising wouldn't be appropriate, because, of course, they managed to avoid most taxes anyway because they're such enormous multinationals. And so I can see a tax working that way, which might nourish, for example, an organisation like New Zealand Air, to a contested block of support, as it did during the much maligned Public Interest Journalism Fund. But yeah, I think it is a difficult day. I also, there's a bit of glee, not glee exactly, there's a little bit of Schadenfreude coming out in some of the reporting. A couple of media organisations are still very keen to describe TVNZ as a state media organisation. It isn't. It's a publicly held media organisation. It's there to benefit, to be owned by the public. Can then have a discussion about how well it's done that. But, it is not a state media broadcaster. And I think by saying that, you end up playing into the hands of the likes of, disappointed Sean Plunkett, bitter, and increasingly provocative David Seymour, who's playing a very interesting
Yeah.
media game and personal game, both in his attacks on academia, so his attacks on Sir Joanna, and today a very nasty little personal attack on a TVNZ journalist. Very interesting, very Winstonish
Yeah.
actually.
So, for those who haven't seen it, there's a Stuff article today which quotes David Seymour, essentially being quietly happy about the problems at TVNZ because of some reporting by Benedict Collins, and on an interview with News Talk ZB, he made some comments about Benedict Collins. Quote from David Seymour: "They've spent years celebrating and dancing at every slip that a politician makes, competing to get scalps, as they call them. And all of a sudden they say, but when we have a bad day, you've got to be kind to us." And
Yeah.
he said that this shows that the media is full of self-pity and have a delightful lack of self-awareness. And it's the journalists, in fact, who are responsible for being a big part of the problem facing media. And it was,
In England.
you've got a
Yeah.
yeah. So
Sorry, we lost
it's
you for a second.
quite a thing.
Yeah, I mean, I'm always reminded of a grumpy old British politician once told me that for a journalist to complain, for a politician to complain about the media, is like a fisherman complaining about the sea. And I think that's what Seymour's doing. And Seymour is, to give him some credit, he is absolutely a brilliant media player. But one of the things that I said on the Jack Tame thing the other day, and I think it's true, and I really thought about this at a Maori media thing that Carmen Parahi, our friend, put on some months ago, where somebody pointed out, in whose interest is it to have a diminution in the trust and power, or the trust and influence, if you like, of media? And to a huge extent, it's in the interests of politicians. And I think Winston Peters and David Seymour have really shown that quite cleverly. I don't necessarily mean it's just sort of evil, but both of them put out extensive material on their own social media networks and social media streams, commenting on all of this in ways that they would once have done to media. And of course we know and remember fondly, to some extent, that Jacinda Ardern was the great bypasser of media with her evening chats with us to get us through the day in a kind of weird Rooseveltian fireside chat. So, that they are brilliant, but it is in their interests to be able to bypass the media, or worse, and this is the kind of David Seymour thing, to cow the media.
Yeah. However, there is an element of live by the sword, die by the sword here, and unfortunately, it's sort of what happened with Jacinda Ardern. Her extensive use of Facebook and decision not to turn off the comments eventually meant the blowback and the swamping of her own social media feeds with
Yeah,
vitriol
by
and
bollocks. That's right.
awfulness.
That's an extremely good point, Bernard, which I think should go into my next thing on this. I think I mean, the other difficult thing, and I've been thinking about discussing it with our friend Patrick Smelly as well, is that given the sort of salami slicing that's gone on of media, there are very few editors. People, even relatively young journalists are publishing more or less straight to the web. You see an alarming number of mistakes in it, but worse, you see, I think, a tendency to commentate or to opine when they should be doing straight news, or a lack of distinguishing between those two. And there's a lot of inexperience there that then gets reflected in a kind of gotcha mentality on the smallest story. And that I find
I,
frustrating. And I say that having been a teenage scribbler and been in an incredible gotcha mentality when I went into Parliament and Muldoon was there, and
yeah, I mean, I have to sort of stand up for the young ones here for a moment. They've grown up in an era
yeah,
when they understood that the only way to keep your job was to ensure you had good ratings and good clicks and big numbers. And they, follow the incentives, and they
that's a very
understand
good
that
point.
a sensational headline, a very strong opinion, a a thing that creates heat as well as light, and often the heat to light ratio is the highest when you get the biggest clicks. They
That's a
understand
very
that
good point,
to
Bernard. I
get
think
ahead,
that's yeah,
you have to perform. Everyone's got the most popular lists of articles right next to them. They get the feedback every week on who got the most likes and who got who got the
mm,
most retweets and all of that stuff. And when you think, I'm really enjoying my job, this is an amazing place to be. But then you look around you and you think, how many people have been here for a long time and
yes,
are actually building their careers here, and
that's
how
right.
many are actually just looking to build a body of
A
experience and then get the hell out of there into a decent PR job.
Yeah, yeah. I think that's a really good sober view of it, and you're right. But it is. I mean, there used to be between, a bolshy little shit like me, who was not genuinely Bolshevik, but I mean in the feisty sense of it, sometimes too feisty. There was usually some grumpy old
It's a pity
bastard
that
on
the
the.
word bolshy has turned into a description of just plain pain in the ass, as opposed to an actual Bolshevik with some
Yes, yes.
actual
Well, I'm
Marxist.
definitely not an actual Bolshevik. But there was always some grumpy old bastard. Usually somebody who'd. I mean, I worked with people at the Evening Post who were on the subs desk who had fought at Guadalcanal. There was, and
Wow.
John Mulgan's brother Dave was there as a court reporter. There were some seriously weighty, and by weighty I mean enormously fat old men on the subs desk who would have let.
Mm.
I'm not saying it should go back to that, but just a little bit of gentle guidance wouldn't go amiss.
Mm.
And I also think, I mean, I think we've discussed this before, that New Zealand publications should be running to join a thing called the Trust Project, which gives you a sort of set of criteria. I notice, in fact, even the Herald, which I know
Mm.
has had a conversation with the Trust Project, now has a little blurb on the bottom of every story which tells you, Bernard Hickey speaks 6 languages and has written 17 books and has been covering this since 1872. And even those little blurbs, I think, are extremely helpful in reinforcing that this is not just a teenage scribbler. And even if they are, all power to teenage scribblers.
Yes, and we need scribblers at the moment because there's an awful lot of news being thrust through.
Mm,
Governments often in their first, couple of months make a point of having a crash or crash through mentality, which is dump all of your bad news all at once, swamp the zone with
mm.
news, and then you can get a lot done while people are busy shouting and pointing and running at the one thing they're particularly upset with. And that's one of the points of a 100-day plan, is to throw as much noise and drama and action into that first 100 days so that there will be pushback, but everyone will be so
You
busy
contain the
pushing back
push
their one
in
thing.
that period. You almost contain it. Yeah, I was thinking actually,
Yeah.
Bernard, we should do a review on the show possibly next week of that book, which I'm absolutely certain that Luxon has, somewhere beside his bed or on his little stack of management 101 books. It's an excellent book for when you take a new job, called The First 90 Days, and it's all about. I
Right.
guarantee, if we were to look it up, we would find words like what was it? What does he like to talk about? Results comes.
Mm.
KPIs, we would find those in there because he is running this process very much like a CEO, and maybe that's what will get us some effect. And I guess we're going to talk a little bit later about this decision today on accelerating big projects.
Yes, the fast track consenting legislation has come out, and it is causing an almighty stink amongst those who are worried about how it's going to affect the environment, but also just worried about some of the democratic aspects of it. We'll talk to
Yeah.
Gary Taylor, the CEO of the Environmental Defence Society, the a person in the environmental activism and law community for many decades, who's seen
Hmm.
many laws come and go and many politicians come and go, and can put into context how important this one is today. But also this week, the government made some major changes to how it's managing emergency housing operations. It also came up with a completely new strategy for running our roads and rail
Hmm.
and bus networks, and how much it's
And
going
our
to spend and what
cycleways,
it's going
i.e.,
to
not
do
having
there.
any.
Yeah, to the point of actually banning banning anyone who's building a new road from putting
Banning
a
those bloody
beside
cyclists.
it.
Yeah.
Yeah,
I
and
bumped
saying
into
things
somebody the
like,
other day who when I mentioned cycleways, said, "Oh, I bloody hate cyclists." I'm one of those who really objects to cyclists, and I just thought, you fucking dinosaur. Now, Bernard, who else have we got today? We've got Robert Patman coming up.
yes, we've got Robert coming up at 5:20 till 5:30, talking about the big events of the week internationally, which you'll be across a lot more than I am. I've been a bit more focused
Oh,
domestically
I'm
this
totally
week.
there. I'm just basically, St. Arnaud or Lake Rotuiti is basically, just moored off Gaza, and I'm watching everything happen
Yeah.
with eagle eyes. And Bernard, we're going to have Gary Taylor, and then you're going to do the Catherine stint. Is that right?
Yeah, I'll talk about some of the things that are happening in the climate and in transport. That's going to be a big deal this week. I've tried to cover the announcements from Simeon Brown about how much is going to be spent on roads, how little is going to be spent on buses and cycling, and how virtually nothing's going to be spent on railways, and how short-sighted and inflationary it is. So that will be a busy sort of 20 minutes or so at the end of the show. It's time though to welcome on Robert Patman, who is joining us from
Nice
around the
segue to
country.
Robert.
Yes, well,
Hello.
we've gone to Nelson, to Peter, and now we
Have
go
you
to
got your hotel
Napier.
bedroom, Robert?
That's right, in Napier.
Excellent. Excellent. I presume there's some top level international conference that you're attending there, are you, or are you just
No, no,
attending
it's
the
part
Art
of a sort
Deco?
of. No, I'm representing the university, speaking to a number of alumni associations. So it's the university promoting itself on the North Island.
Excellent. Well, I can't think of anybody to be promoting it more than you.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Not everyone shares that
Yeah.
view, but never mind.
So, Robert,
Away you go,
Bernard
Peter.
just set us up very well. I don't think I sent you my thing for the spin-off today, my last one for them, but
I
I'm
did.
I'm
I read it with great interest.
I'm kind of interested in this can we address perhaps the implications? We've talked about it a little bit, but just that weekend airdrop by the Americans just looked to me to absolutely pathetic. I hadn't realised though until that happened that the UAE and I think France have also made airdrops into Gaza. And then of course you've got
Yes,
this series of gaffes, or not so much gaffes actually, hopes perhaps from Biden that the ceasefire discussions would start, and that there might even be a ceasefire before Ramadan. What are you seeing at the moment?
well, I'm having a similar view. I think the United States highlights the hypocrisy of their policy. They are going to it's very expensive and ineffective way of feeding a desperately hungry population of 2.3 million people. We know that in the last 10 days, more than 10 babies, according to UNICEF, have died from malnutrition, and a population of more than 500,000 Palestinians are now facing starvation. So I do think it's an extraordinary situation where a superpower is airdropping food supplies in, and at the same time arming
Yes.
a side which is facilitating the starvation that is occurring. So they're both arming and feeding the crisis to some degree.
It's a weird irony, isn't it? And it doesn't Netanyahu doesn't seem to be budging at all. And you've got the Hamas, some of the Hamas leaders sitting in Egypt waiting for this conversation to start, and still, of course, with that threat of a major attack on Rafah hanging over everything.
Yes, and I was really interested in your article, Peter, because you thought that the bear hug strategy was both principled and logical. I would disagree with that. I think the bear hug strategy
It's my
was
doctrine.
not
Yeah.
particularly principled and was not particularly logical. And the reason I say that is that Mr. Biden knew all about Mr. Netanyahu. He had tough experience during the Obama years when he was vice president. And it seems to me that this confirms that the United States does, if it does have leverage, it's not prepared to use it. And it seems to me at the moment the administration is engaged in behind the scenes negotiation mediation involving Qatar and also Egypt and Israel for a 1 month respite during Ramadan, which is due next week. And that to me, a temporary ceasefire with 30,000 Palestinians dead and the United States unwilling to actually cut off the arms supply.
Can you
Looks pretty weak. It looks like the tail is wagging the superpower's dog, and it confirms that Mr. Biden is not prepared to use his leverage.
Yeah, it was interesting, Robert. Well, a few months ago when this all started, and I wrote quite a lot about the history of people like Ariel Sharon and others taking, big right wingers taking big decisions that were rather bold, and you kind of hoped that Netanyahu might discover that kind of morality. My daughter said, "But Dad, this is genocide."
Yes, and that's the view of many young people. And the extraordinary thing is that the message does not seem to be getting through to Mr. Biden, despite some pretty definite warning signals with regard to the primaries in the United States. The Democrats seem to be confident they can recover ground somehow in the next few months. The senior Democrats seem to be, still believing that not all is lost and that Biden can rally and do something extraordinary. But even if Mr. Biden does a complete U-turn now, I'm not sure those uncommitted Democrats, mainly young people, are going to rally behind him and say, "Oh, Joe's done the right thing after doing it wrong for 5 months," and many innocent Palestinians dying as a result of American policy, providing unconditional support for Israel following the horrendous Hamas attack on the 7th of October.
I know we have a tendency to stretch your academic qualifications to breaking point on this show, but it is extremely interesting to see what happened in the Super Tuesday overnight. To some extent, Trump has only got around 49% of the possible Republican vote in that. And of course, Nikki Haley has now dropped out and hasn't endorsed him. He's
I can't hear you, Peter.
We seem to have dropped out there with Peter, Robert.
Hello?
I will,
No, I think I'm back.
You're
back.
back.
Sorry.
Go for it.
There's a rather wonderful
No worries.
interview in the New Yorker this week with Evan Osnos, who's one of the biographers of Biden, and he makes the point in here. One of the recent polls by the end of January, when pollsters were asked immigration and border control, Trump led Biden by 57 to 22 on the border.
Right.
On the economy, 55 to 33, which is completely ridiculous given what Trump did to the economy last time.
Yes.
And on the
huge
required mental and physical stamina for the presidency, Biden won 40. Sorry, Trump got 43%.
Yeah.
So we are staring down the barrel here at a Trump cakewalk to some extent.
I'm
In
not
the
sure
election,
about
I mean.
that. I still
Oh,
think
Christ.
Mr. Trump is a mercurial candidate who's quite capable of creating, inflicting injuries to himself politically in the run-up, let alone all the different law. He's facing over 100 legal charges. There's another thing here that we shouldn't sweep under the carpet. He's one of the most serious charges regards Mr. Trump taking 14,000 classified documents out of the White House. A number of international lawyers say there's not much wiggle room with that one, particularly since he returned them, and also he involved apparently aids in attempts to hide the documents. So, of course, he may be able to buy time sufficiently in appeal against any judgments made, but it does seem serious. We'll have to wait and see. I still am skeptical that Mr. Trump, I think Mr. Trump's way to the White House is through the third-party candidate doing well, rather than Mr. Trump defeating Biden per se.
Interesting.
Just to wrap up, Robert, on geopolitical affairs in Ukraine. This week, more signs that a lack of ammunition is hurting the Ukrainians as they try to fend off the Russians. And also, I've been transfixed by this story about the German generals talking about sending missiles to Ukraine and doing it on a WebEx. a WebEx.
It wasn't so much the WebEx; it was the guy calling in from his hotel room in Singapore.
That's
Apparently,
right.
was the
Hello,
breach.
It's the FSB here. That's right. You're on mute. I mean,
Yes,
I just
Mr.
it's
Sergei
like,
Lavrov appreciated that.
Yeah, I
Yeah.
mean, it is really like a Johnny English
Extraordinary indiscretion.
episode. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, it's an extraordinary situation, and I think the German government are in complete, well, I wouldn't say complete, but in considerable disarray over this issue. And they're
Did
trying
you see,
to
though, that the Russian German defense minister said he'd talked to all the allies and they still had full confidence. This is after the guys said, not only said, basically don't tell anybody. I mean, I said don't tell anybody, but the Brits and the French are in there. And the Brits are going in and looking after their Storm Shadow missiles. And by the way, they're driving them in Audi Q7s. The registration number is... I mean, it's just madness.
But I think Pistorius's full confidence statements are the equivalent of the chairperson of a football club when the manager's had about 7 defeats on the trot.
Yeah.
Says no, the manager's got nothing to worry about. The board has full confidence in the manager in question.
Yeah.
I think it's that sort of full confidence statement.
That's right.
A hollow one, in short. But I mean, it's a serious development, and it shows a considerable breach of security within the German government. But yeah, I mean, there's increasing signs that Ukraine is desperately short of weapons, and again, never a night goes by before Russia faces huge explosions within their homeland. So it's a very uneven sort of picture that we're seeing here. There have been attacks also in Crimea and on the Kerch Bridge, which is a very sensitive area for the Russians. I do think the Ukrainians have, refocused again on Crimea, but they do desperately need to hold the lines that they have, and that involves artillery to some degree. So the asymmetrical strategy, which they seem to have ramped up since the shake-up that we previously discussed in the military, the Zelensky shake-up of the military, I should say, it needs to be underpinned by a reliable supply of munitions and artillery.
Robert, I know you have to go in just a tick and start drinking superb Hawke's Bay wines with your alum. I was wondering what you thought about the current situation with the Houthis. I mean, they've had some, from their point of view, success. Right. One of those ships has been sunk. Another one, which apparently until about 2 days ago was owned by Oak Tree Capital and was sold, but unfortunately that information didn't get through to the Houthis before they hit it yesterday. But it does seem to be firming up that they're also attacking undersea cables. What I mean, we're in quite a
Yes, and I
protracted
think,
problem there.
but there were warnings to the. I mean, I think the warning signs were there when the initial strikes by the US and UK, and subsequently supported by New Zealand and Australia, were not having a deterring effect on the Houthis. This is a battle-hardened group, and they're not going to relent, in my view. And they're going to express their displeasure at the failure of the international community to facilitate a permanent ceasefire, and they're doing it with the instruments available at their disposal, which includes, and this is alarming, cutting cables. I'm, in a sense, I'm not sure how the US and UK are going to respond to this. The best way to respond, in my judgment, would be for the US to do a U-turn and embrace a permanent ceasefire, because the Houthis would have absolutely no excuse to continue illegal activity in Red Sea if illegal activity ceased in Gaza, and they have pledged to do that. So we would test out their word.
Well, look, thanks so much for coming, and I hope not to see your hotel room in other states, but I hope you have a lovely time in Napier.
No, I'll be back in Dunedin on Friday night.
See you soon.
Fantastic, Robert.
Thank
you
you.
so much for being on the show. We're going to have
Pleasure. Good to see you guys.
See you.
It's great. We're going to have Gary Taylor join us shortly to talk about the quick consenting bill. And as we speak, I can look out my window and see the biggest, fattest kereroo chowing down on some,
Kereroo. Yeah. I don't think we have kereroos.
Kereroo,
Do we have kereroos in the South Island? We don't have them around here, but I did see two
sort of
absolutely
fat and
gorgeous
happy.
bellbirds this morning.
Oh, lovely. That's lovely.
And
lovely
out on
to
my
hear.
run, I met a
Just on
chap.
the international
which-
stuff.
Yeah. It's all right. I was going to
There
give you
you
an
go.
anecdote, but go for the international stuff first.
Yeah. So on the international stuff, we've had plenty of spy scandals this week, and I don't know if you've been watching this thing developing in Australia.
I most
where
certainly have.
The
Yeah.
head of the ASIO, the spy agencies in Australia, has pointed out that there was a very senior politician who had been recruited by the so-called A-Team, which has since been revealed to be China's MSS, the Chinese version of the FSB, KGB, and that he tried to recruit a member of a prime minister's family. It is an extraordinary thing that's roiling Australian politics. They're all calling for the name of this politician to be released, and it seems
Yeah,
pretty
well, it's an
obvious
extraordinary
this
thing
guy
to drop
actually,
in like that,
signed
isn't it,
up.
Bernard? Yeah, I mean, for the head of ASIO to just drop the person isn't a serving politician now. It appears to be a politician of Chinese descent. It would appear. And I asked one of our favourite Chinese academic experts in New Zealand about this because I thought she might have a rather Schadenfreude view of this, and she just said, "I'm glad the Australians are listening and that somebody's actually acting on this." And I did notice that the former Prime Minister, which one was it? His son said that he had been approached. But it looked, and I think those approaches are often made. It's a little bit like that kind of Hunter Biden case where you've got people who are very keen to get politically connected people involved in those kinds of escapades. But it has become this weird, slightly unpleasant guessing game in Australia. But it is important to remember that this is almost exactly what we've been talking about in New Zealand as well, right? With the infiltration, the presence of people with historic links to the Chinese Communist Party in not insignificant roles in the New Zealand Parliament. In both parties, in fact.
And yes. So obviously, I declare some interest in this. In 2017, I helped organise an investigation into the National Party list MP Jian Yang, who it turns out had been trained by Chinese military intelligence and had been a senior officer in their ranks, training other spies in China before he went through the Australian National University in Canberra and was we understand, told to leave, and ended up in New Zealand and found his way into the National Party very quickly, became a list MP. And by the time we reported on this, he was the head of the Parliamentary Foreign Affairs
Yeah,
and
what could possibly happen in
Trade
the
Committee.
Parliamentary Foreign Affairs Committee? Yeah, it's a great job.
And
For them to have somebody in there is a great job.
he then went on after National lost power to chaperone the then leader, Simon Bridges of the National Party, and the then Foreign Affairs spokesman, now Parliamentary Speaker Jerry Brownlee, on a trip to meet the head of the spy agency without the permission or the notification of MFAT, which has
Good Lord.
been documented and commented on in public in the past. Now, since then, Jerry Brownlee has not gone on to become the foreign minister. Obviously, Winston Peters is the foreign minister, and he seems to have a much more robust approach to dealing with China. And it's interesting how the tone of the prime minister has changed on China as soon as he became the prime minister, because it's interesting. A lot of the serious briefings that politicians get from the spies, basically, about what's going on, who's attacking us, and how they're doing it, doesn't for obvious reasons isn't on the top of the news bulletins or out in public. It happens behind the scenes, and once people have been properly briefed about what's really going on, they suddenly become a lot more circumspect
Yeah,
and wary of
that was what was
how China in particular uses its operations.
Yeah, that was one of the things that was particularly interesting, Bernard. I thought about the ASIO guy, the head of ASIO's comments, because he said this person was not an unwitting. He didn't sort of unwittingly fall into a honey trap or something, or into a alleged collusion. He knew what he was. It was a man or a woman, knew what they were doing.
Yeah, and I suspect there's more to play out in this story in Australia, and I think it's one that we should try and keep an eye on.
Yeah,
And it is a real a one to watch in particular. We now have Gary Taylor joining us. Gary is the CEO of the Environmental Defence Society. Gary, thank you very much for joining us on the Hoon here. We've gone around the world talking about the issues in Gaza, in the Ukraine. We've talked about the government's efforts in housing and in transport. But the big news today, Gary, is the announcement of some of the detail of the government's new fast-track consenting legislation. I wondered if you could tell us, from your point of view as a long-time observer of New Zealand's environmental law, regulation, legislation, how important today's legislation is.
Yeah, well, it's pretty important. I mean, I've been around for a while, and I'd have to say this is the most troubling bit of law that I've come across in terms of its potential for adverse impacts on our natural world. To be a conscious decision, and I think they've been quite transparent about unsettling in a way, to prioritise economic development over the environment at all costs. So it's gangbusters, and we'll go for broke. And if there's threatened species in the way, then as Shane Jones said, goodbye, Freddie.
Yeah, just to sort of
frogs
for
are always
our
called Freddie
younger
somehow, aren't
listeners,
they? Yeah.
Gary, just for some of our younger listeners, and even Peter, who was actually reporting on Parliament in the mid to late 80s, could you put into context the importance of the National Development Act of 1979 that was driven through by the then Prime Minister Robert Muldoon and a guy called Bill Birch? Can you tell us about how that galvanized the environmental movement, but also led to a bunch of things that means we have our current legislative framework?
Yeah, well, I mean, if we don't learn from our history, we're doomed to repeat it. as they say, and this is a case in point, I think. It was legislation that was designed to stimulate economic growth, to cut through red tape, green tape, and do all of the things that's being said about today's bill. It's almost as if they, drew from that same playbook and are just repeating it. So for me, it's a bit like Groundhog Day. Surely we're not going back to that kind of world where, we pretend that we can't have economic development without environmental degradation, because that approach is not correct. We can have economic development subject to environmental bottom lines. We're clever enough now to do that. And the lesson from the National Development Act is that this bill won't last.
What do you mean? What do you mean won't
wondered,
last, Gary? Do you mean that it won't last beyond a term, or because if you could ask the "it won't last" question, but also Gary, you must go slightly mad at this, thinking, "Oh my God, I thought I defeated this last time in 1970, no, 19 in the 80s. You're being forced to repeat it all again."
Yeah, that's right. And I don't like talking about that too much because it makes me sound potentially old and out of date, and I'm not.
Me neither.
I think that I think no, that's right. I think that what's different here is the way that, I mean, even back in the late 70s, there were people in that cabinet who had a sense of constitutional propriety, if you like. People like Doug was very strong on doing things properly, and that was the old National Party, and what we've got here is we've got a government that's being driven by the 6% party on this. And Shane Jones is one of the ministers. I mean, I've known Shane all his life, and respect what he has to offer in many respects. He's completely changed his position on this, of course, and when he was a Labour MP, if you look at some of the speeches that he made back then, basically saying we can't have fast track because it's going back to the National Development Act, and now we are.
Well, let's dig it. Bernard and I will be digging that up before you can. Yeah.
Yes. No. I wondered, Gary, just to impress upon people who may not have read the detail of the bill that's come through today, and you've been following the development of this bill. Can you give us a sense of what the scope of it is, whether it's just a rehashed version of the COVID fast track legislation or something more?
Yeah. So we had the COVID fast track legislation, which was to try to stimulate economic growth during a national emergency, akin to a wartime situation, really. And then that was carried over into the Natural and Built Environment Act, which the Labor government passed before the election and National then repealed. But they repealed it by continuing to hold intact the then fast track provisions. Now, what's different now is that the environmental protections that were in or are in the current law, because it still stands, have been removed. Ministers have absolute discretion to override environmental matters. The whole purpose of the bill is premised on development or bust. I think it's constitutionally questionable as to whether it's appropriate to give the executive that much power. It puts ministers, and this is something I've said to the Prime Minister, it puts them in a risky position because of the potential for corrupt practice, either perceived or actual, and for pork barrel politics to determine what developments occur here or not. And it's not just about infrastructure. It's not just about roads and power and renewables. It's also about mining, gold mining, coal mining, offshore deep sea mining. These are things that are very complex and really do need thorough appraisal and not some kind of fast track superficial approach, which is what we've got for them.
Gary, because I've got a slight delay on some of my, my internet connection here at Nelson Lakes is not as perfect as it should be, and I'll improve it by the time we come back on Thursday. But are there legitimate criticisms of? There's two questions. Are there legitimate criticisms of the Resource Management Act? Is it too unwieldy? And the second question is, you mentioned that this bill won't last, but I thought it was very interesting that Shane Jones is talking about indemnities to protect oil companies or energy companies that invest in New Zealand from the consequences of another government repealing their licenses later. They're aware of that.
Yeah. Yeah, well, on the first point, I mean, I think just about everybody agrees that the RMA is no longer fit for purpose and should be ditched. And the Labor government did that. We worked with them for 5 years to get the Natural and Built Environment Act and the Spatial Planning Act up. I thought they weren't perfect, but they were a good start, and National could have panel beated them into shape.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, one of the key concerns that they had was some of the Maori terminology in there. Well, whatever you think about that, it's actually fixable without ditching the whole act. And so, the RMA is, I mean, nobody disagrees with the need for fast tracking for important national projects. All resource consenting should be efficient and speedy, not just a privileged few who manage to get into the hands of the minister. On the second point, I think I can't see any offshore oil and gas companies coming into New Zealand in the current climate, literally and metaphorically, of course. And I think the promise from an alternative government that it would reverse things. I mean, governments can reverse stuff, even indemnities, I would have thought. And I think that's just a bit of bluster, and I don't think we should take it too seriously. I don't think expansion is as big a risk as some of the other mining activities, which may or may not be good for the economy, but we won't know because the process is too superficial to get to the bottom of it.
Gary, and what about these panels of experts that are going to be somehow assisting the minister in these decisions? Do we know what that panel's makeup is likely to be?
My understanding is there's going to be two panels. There's going to be one created quite soon that's going to act as a gatekeeper for scheduled projects that get into the fast track straight away. Well, what I would say about that is that experts getting involved in that kind of exercise would want to think about the reputational risk involved, because I think a lot of the resource management profession is pretty concerned about, this whole approach, and would you want to nail your flag to that mast? And then the second lot of specialist panels will be on individual projects. Ministers will refer projects to them. They'll assess them with limited standing for third parties to engage, I might add, and refer a recommendation with proposed conditions back to ministers. Now, at that point, ministers can essentially bully their way through the decision-making process and impose their own preferences on top of that of the recommendation. So, we're going to have a select committee process. I hope it's not going to be fast-tracked because we need time to get to the bottom of all of this, and there'll be a lot of people wanting to have a say.
My understanding, Gary, that it is going to be pushed through under urgency. From what
The
I've
bill is
seen
going through
announced.
under urgency, but whether it's been introduced under urgency for its first reading, then it goes to a select committee. The select committee might be fast-tracked or might not. The normal course of events, the select committee would have 6 months to consider the thing and report back. But, this government is just
Christ,
so
we could have a new
gung-ho.
power
That's
station by
probably
then.
an
We could have a new power station in that time, Gary, or a rare earths mine just behind me on the edge of the national park at Nelson.
There you go.
Yeah, Gary, just to finally just step back and look at how much has changed here. We've gone from the National Development Act, which essentially is a 1979 version of this, which was designed to ram through think big projects, and the social and political firestorm it effectively created when the Clyde Dam was rammed through, all sorts of other plants were rammed through, eventually led, I think, to the 1984 landslide election defeat of Muldoon, and then the actual creation of the Resource Management Act and various attempts, ending, I think, in MMP, to try to control the executive power of a government and one man or one cabinet from riding roughshod over our democracy. How on earth have we got back here again?
Through
Yeah,
MMP.
yeah. You should get Jeffrey Palmer. You should get Jeffrey Palmer on the program. Unbridled
Yes.
power. He and that's certainly where we've got to again. And I think it's because people's memories are short. They're not prepared to learn from our past mistakes. And it's very one-dimensional. It's superficial. It's crude thinking, actually. And I'm particularly disappointed and worried about what it means for our environment. I say again, there's no reason why we can't fast track nationally important projects, but we don't have to stuff up the environment in the process. And this bill will allow that to happen.
And
Gary,
it was
let me
interesting
ask you
to
a
hear in
question.
Parliament today, James.
Go ahead. Sorry.
Oh, just one final thing, and then over to Peter for the last question. It was interesting to hear in Parliament today, James Shaw used the phrase, we've gone from unbridled power to unhinged power in describing this
He's pretty
legislation.
good. He's been set free.
Yeah, no, that's not a bad line. Yeah. Go for
James
it,
is
Peter,
going to be a
sorry.
big loss.
Yeah.
Gary, we
You-
media on this show as well from time to time. One of the aspects of countries having a short memory is surely the media. Do you see a gap or a problem in the way the New Zealand news media handles these kinds of stories? Is there, other than Bernard and me, a lack of long memory?
Well, I think there's a lack of sort of recent history, and it's also being written out of syllabuses, really. So, I mean, I think that our media does serve us well. It's obviously beleaguered at the moment. I'm worried about what it might mean for the Fourth Estate, which does hold these kinds of actions to account. I mean, you guys, other podcasts, Newsroom with its long pieces, News Hub, the Herald, NZME, Radio New Zealand. These are all important parts of our political fabric that are very much under risk at the moment, at a time when we need them to be alert and on the job.
Thank you, Gary. That's really
Yes.
interesting to have that. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much, Gary, for coming on to the show. We've had you on for a little bit longer than we expected, and thank you so much for going through the technicals of getting on. It's wonderful to hear from you, and I will be referring to your statement today, which I think is a very good summary of some of the not the risks, but the history of this massive potential change in how projects are approved in New Zealand. Thank you very much for being on the Hoon.
Okay, thanks guys.
Gary.
Good night.
Cheers. So we're in lovely natural places at the moment. Peter.
We
You're
are,
in
Bernard. Yeah, but
Nelson
I'm saying
Lakes.
I'm
It's one of
going
the
to have
most
to move
beautiful
slightly
places.
closer to the internet connection next time, but on for next Thursday.
Yeah,
Or I could do it from the top of the hill where
that's
we
right.
went up, and then poor old Simon, our producer, would be saying, "Could you just yell into that microphone? There's too much wind."
And you'd also have to watch out for frostbite, I think, up there at the moment. I think this week has been one of the most momentous I've seen in recent years of politics, and that includes the likes of some of the things that happened during COVID, because we've seen a really ugly turn in the tone of our public debate, in which at the same time a big chunk of the journalists who work every day to try to cover these changes and effectively, provide some sort of speaking truth to power and challenging those in power, they've been not just lost their jobs, but being ridiculed and attacked by those people in power. At the same time, we've seen massive changes proposed to how we run our transport system and now how we approve our major projects, and taken us back to a time when our form of government, which is weak in a way. We don't have a second chamber. We don't have a Supreme Court able to interpret a very clear and tough constitution. Essentially, if you're the Prime Minister and you have control of Parliament through your party or coalition of parties, you can do anything you want. And
Yeah, I thought it was very
the
interesting,
danger
Bernard,
here,
that Gary called up the 6%, that he's being driven by the 6%. And I think very few would argue that both David Seymour and Winston Peters appear to have a very, very heavy level of influence in this coalition under Luxon.
And Luxon is not keeping them under control. He has lost touch with the middle part of New Zealand, who are centrist, conservative, don't like fast, rapid change, certainly don't like it when politicians do things to them in the middle of the night when they're not our single chamber, no constitution government. Will think of this week and realise that a coalition under MMP, which was supposed to moderate power and avoid sort of rapid lurches in policy. But we have just had a rapid lurch in policy in all sorts of ways. And this week it came home to roost on the last day of the 100-day plan, in which a massive piece of legislation is being rammed through under urgency without the list of projects that are going to be ticked off in it. And we're going to put the power to put massive projects into the hands of a single person, a minister. And we know from the reporting ahead of this election that the parties in charge receive $7 in donation for every $1 received by the Labour and Green parties, and that the two minor parties, ACT and New Zealand First, on their own out fundraised Labour and the Greens. We're now in new territory, I think, for our democracy and for our legislative system, and this was the week it happened.
Bernard, that's an excellent soliloquy. And I'm also reminded of, we haven't heard it for a few weeks, but one of the lines that you hear, particularly from Shane Jones, actually, I think we heard it from him yesterday, and we've certainly heard it from David Seymour and Winston, is the "we won, you lost." This is what the majority wants, and we're executing on it. That doesn't sound tremendously democratic to me.
No, it's also, in a way, not true. I mean, there was certainly no suggestion of the changes on smoke-free before we've just had them rammed through under urgency. There's a bunch of things that were done in the coalition negotiations that have surprised a whole bunch of people who voted for them. For example, more than half of the supporters of National ACT and New Zealand First were opposed to the repeal of the smoke-free rules that National rammed through this week. A lot of the people who were quite proud within the National Party of the treaty settlements, the the progress in, for example, creating whānau order, with the way that large parts of Māori business was being integrated into our economy, are aghast at the crude and frankly racist approach that members of the government are taking to tell Māori. And it is, I think Luxon has lost touch with that centrist, conservative part of National. He is underestimating the danger of his government, which is supposed to be a centrist government, being pulled dramatically to the right by people who have at most 10 or 11% of the vote. That's not how democracies are supposed to work. That's not how MMP was supposed to work. And I think we're into some interesting territory. I'd like to finish off actually with a quote, ironically, from David Seymour. So you might recall that last year, Kerry Allen, the then Justice spokesperson, gave an off-the-record speech at a leaving party for her then partner, a Radio New Zealand presenter, in which she made some critical comments about the RNZ management. And she was hauled over the coals about this, and there was a big drama about whether the speech notes would be released. And in that process, David Seymour criticised Kerry Allen for using her power as a minister to, in theory, bully a member of the media, the state-owned media. Whereas today, David Seymour essentially did exactly the same thing to a political reporter who may or may not still be working as a political reporter because of decisions made by that state-owned organisation. And but last year, David Seymour said this: "There is a real problem when the people who hold the purse strings aren't absolutely critically cautious about even the perception of interfering with media. Nobody loses their democracy all at once," said David Seymour. "It always happens 1,000 little chips, and we don't want to see them. It's good she's apologised, but I can't believe she did it." How different things look a year on. Peter,
Bernard,
thank you
that's
very
a
much
very,
for,
very Sean
jumping
Plunkett-ish little book. I think Simon should chunk that up for you, those two soliloquies, and we get those out on social media and have you up against Sean Plunkett. And I also think Gary's point about having Jeffrey Palmer on is a very, very good one, although we would probably have to go to either to 2 hours or cancel all other guests, because my recollection is that he can talk their leg off an iron pot.
Yes.
As
But
my
with
mother would have said.
Knowledge and experience, he would be a good person to talk to. I'm sure he will be grabbed in the next few weeks. Although, sadly, there will be a bunch of reporters out there being told to cover the story, going, who should I talk to? And someone will say to them, haven't you heard about this guy called Jeffrey Palmer? Haven't you heard of unbridled power? And they'll go, who? What?
Yeah.
Yeah. Anyway,
Exactly.
Onwards and upwards. Peter, thank you very much.
So shall we
we'll talk to you
do a
next
quick
week from
skateboarding
Nelson.
dog?
Oh yes, sure. Great. We need some levity
So
after that.
as you know, Bernard, I'm a bit of a Formula One fan. Anything to consume more fossil fuels in an ostentatious fashion and drive cars incredibly fast around authoritarian states. But there was quite a nice story during the week.
It's a pity because there's an absolutely excellent electric Formula One.
Oh yes, the two.
style
Formula
league,
E
which
is
quite extraordinary.
brilliant. Yep, absolutely. No, Formula E is actually the great thing about Formula E is that they're incredibly close, and they do it around places like Hong Kong. But anyway, don't interrupt me. So during the 1995, at the end of the 1995 San Marino Grand Prix in Italy, Gerhard Berger, who was then a Ferrari driver and was a rather stylish Austrian driver of those days, noticed that his red Ferrari 512 M Testarossa, which is the one that boys, not me, used to have on their walls, usually with somebody quite glamorous stretched across it, and he noticed that it was being driven away by a thief at the 1990 feet. And the part of the story that kind of interests me is that he golf and gave chase. And of course, if Volkswagen Golf was not really up to giving chase to a Testarossa. But anyway, it was stolen. And 28 years later, this week, it's been discovered because the Metropolitan Police got a warning about it being up at an auction. But it's been shipped. It was shipped from Italy to Japan, and now it's been shipped to the UK. And the car is presumably going back to Gerhard Berger.
Oh,
There isn't really
good
a
for
punchline
him.
there, Bernard.
And I imagine that is a
exactly.
beautiful car. Yeah.
I'm
No,
not. Well,
now
I
just
think
needs
it's
to put an
very much
electric-
of its 80s time.
electric
You know,
engine in
it's
it and drive it.
It's shoulder pad. Actually, well, funny you should mention the electric engine in things, because there are people who will put an electric engine in. As you know, I don't have a Ferrari Testarossa, but I do have a 1984 Renault Quattrelle in Europe. 10 times what it's worth. I could get it converted to electricity.
Yes, I will look forward to that.
Yeah. I'm
Peter,
thinking
thank
of
you
it,
very
Bernard.
much.
I'm thinking about
Simon will be tearing. That's right. Simon will be tearing
what little hair
his
he has
hair
out. Yeah.
Yeah. Thank you very much to everyone.
Thank you, everybody.
That's been another edition of The Hoon. We'll talk again next Thursday at 5 o'clock. Ka kite anō.
Excellent editorializing, Bernard. Brilliant. Good on you.